Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to dive in and talk about the rise of populism and the political reformation that happens at the end of the Gilded Age, which paves the way for the rise of the progressive movement. So for today, more detail on the whole cross of gold. So today we're going to look at again the things that led to the rise of the populist movement, the extent to which the populists represent a realignment of the third party system, and the successes and failures of populism. So as you hopefully remember, the third party system has really been on its deathbed here since the end of the Civil War. The third party system was the reorganization into Democrats and Republicans with the central issue of slavery. But during this time period, during the whole Gilded Age and post-Reconstruction era, we had basically the three main issues that we talked about before: tariffs and protectionism, civil service reform, and the whole currency reform issue and bimetallism. And so all of that had led to divides within the two political parties. But if you looked at the policies of both Democrats and Republicans throughout the Gilded Age, at least on the national level, with the exception of tariffs, they were pretty consistent in that although there were some attempts to pass reform in order to sort of restrain big business, in general, none of this was effective. Both parties served the interests of industrialists. And for the average person, there wasn't much differentiation between the platforms of Democrats and Republicans. So despite all of this factionalism and despite all of the corruption in the political machines, the difference between Democrat and Republican rule was pretty negligible. In the election of 1892, the Benjamin Harrison administration really wasn't super popular. Benjamin Harrison, for the first time ever, Congress spent $1 billion, which admittedly they had the money because, combination of high tariffs and Grover Cleveland's fiscal responsibility led them to have a significant surplus in the Treasury. And Grover Cleveland, of course, wasn't in politics. And so we saw massive amounts of corruption start to rise in both New York City and the New York State and the country in general. And so Benjamin Harrison was seen as kind of a corrupt tool of the establishment. Congress was seen as wasting a lot of money. And so 92 was more or less a rematch of 88, except this time we saw the rise of this populist force that really is going to play a spoiler effect and help to sort of flip the election, the election and the electoral system back. Populism grew out of all of the challenges that we saw so far. Farmers feeling like they'd lost respect in an age of industrialization, their feeling of exploitation by railroads and big businesses, the significant decreases in the price of farm commodities due to a combination of increased acreage and new technology. And so all of this has led to increased farmer debt and real difficulties for farmers to try to make ends meet. Specifically, farmers saw the railroads as their enemy, as railroad monopolies led farmers to have to pay relatively high shipping costs for their goods, which were very difficult to recoup because, of course, falling grain and commodity prices meant that their bottom line was their profits were all the more thin. And so they were arguing that a combination of government exploitation and railroad consolidation was hurting them, and they were trying to wake up the rest of society to this movement. In the end, the platforms of the populists, they're going to have their first convention in Omaha. They come down to these things. One, they want an unlimited coinage of silver to create inflation. This is the whole cross of gold bimetallism thing. They'd like a progressive income tax in order to raise revenues and of course, tax the wealthy more. They would like government ownership of railroads in order to provide fairer prices, and in order to appease workers, a shortened workday. And so the goal here is to, again, unify workers and farmers in this sort of cross profession alliance of struggling people in order to try to take on the status quo and the aristocrats. Here's the Omaha platform. You should take a moment to read it. And we get the first ever populist candidate for president who's pushing this platform of bimetallism. They wanted to significantly expand the Sherman Silver Purchase Act and to increase the amount of money in circulation to help out farmers. Anti-populist forces came back and pushed back against this, arguing that although this would help silver miners and this might help farmers, it would pretty substantially hurt workers because any inflation would then be passed on to workers in higher prices, And because unskilled workers have very little bargaining power, it's unlikely that their wages would be able to keep up with inflation. And so this worker farmer alliance never truly happened. The Wizard of Oz is, of course, has been seen as a populist allegory to try to convince people to support this whole thing. With Dorothy as your average American, she follows the yellow brick road or the gold standard to get back to prosperity in Kansas. She realizes that the president can't actually help her. And in the end, she had her silver slippers or bimetallism with her the whole time, and that's going to get her back to Kansas and prosperity. And so embracing bimetallism is the answer. And then, of course, you have all these various cast of characters, each representing an element of American society. Frank Lloyd Baum has argued that the Wizard of Oz was not actually a populist allegory, but man, it fits pretty closely. So I'm going to keep teaching it as if it was. Here's Mary Lease arguing in support of the populists. So take a moment, pause, read this. Hopefully, you're able to see some elements of talking about the unequal distribution of wealth, targeting Rockefeller. And in general, the problem that the populist had is their coalition is just too diverse. There's too many holes, there's too many different things that these people want, and a lot of this stuff, especially free coinage of silver, is going to work cross purposes. And so the same policies that are going to help out farmers are going to hurt workers. And so trying to build a populist coalition is probably never going to happen. In 92, we see populists stealing votes out west from Republicans. Not that this would have led to Benjamin Harrison winning anyway, because he probably would have lost to Grover Cleveland regardless. But out west, we see a number of states voting populist. Most famously, of course, Kansas goes populist and elects at the local level a lot of populist officials. But Grover Cleveland is going to get another 4-year term here, partially because of the spoiler effect of the populists. Unfortunately for Grover Cleveland, the economy crashes in 93. This is a global financial panic that's created by the collapse of an Argentinian railroad, which leads to the collapse of some British banks, which leads to a liquidity crisis. And the United States staying on the gold standard, as Grover Cleveland wanted, is going to lead to the collapse of a lot of banks as their currency reserves run out. And then we've got another economic depression. We get one of the first ever mass movements in response to this. Unemployed workers attempt to march on Washington, D.C. in order to demand aid in Coxey's army. But in the end, the federal government, the Cleveland administration responds, locks them up, and this movement fails. They're branded as radicals and socialists, and the movement never really takes off. In the end, J.P. Morgan writes the U.S. government a check to help bail us out of the Depression of 93, and the economy recovers relatively quickly from this financial panic. We also, as a result of this, see a massive rail strike, the Pullman rail strike. This is the first major rail strike since the Great Railroad Strike that we talked about at the beginning of this unit. We're starting to see the larger unions, like the American Railways Union, unionize workers across states to attempt to shut down rail travel. The issue in the Pullman rail strike is the same sort of issue in which workers' living costs were rising, but their wages were not, and so they decided to attempt to shut down rail travel. And Eugene Debs, the labor organizer, is going to be arrested over the course of this whole strike, thrown in prison. The Cleveland administration sends in federal troops to open up the railroads using the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up the union, and the workers fail to create real change. The guy who brings these populist ideas into the mainstream is William Jennings Bryan. Up until this point, the populists and the socialists had been dismissed by the status quo as out-of-touch rural hayseeds who don't have any real place anywhere near the levers of power or sort of in polite company. But William Jennings Bryan, a fiery populist politician from Nebraska, is going to run as a Democratic candidate using populist ideas. And so he's going to win the nomination for president in the next round of elections in 96. And the Democratic Party is going to start representing this sort of political interventionism represented by populism. William Jennings Bryan gives a famous speech called the Cross of Gold speech. So take a moment, pause, read this. And what we really see is all of these groups, this diverse coalition coming together to metaphorically take over the Democratic Party. And so, to some extent, the populists are going to become Democrats. The Democrats are going to kind of become populists. William Jennings Bryan obviously makes a terrifying snake. And we're going to get the Republican Party running as the party of big business and the status quo, and the Democratic Party running as the party of change, of farmers, and of poor people, ostensibly. William Jennings Bryan is going to travel around the country, giving thousands and thousands of speeches to huge groups of people. He's going to travel, as it says here, 18,000 miles to speak to crowds, sometimes giving up to 15 speeches a day, emphasizing these themes, basically the idea that the gold standard is destroying us, we need government intervention to help laborers, things like that. And he's going to be painted as a dangerous radical by the status quo. So take a moment. Here's William Jennings Bryan versus the Republican candidate, William McKinley. And the Republicans basically decide we need to answer and push back against William Jennings Bryan, or else it's possible that his attempt to form this populist coalition will succeed. The trusts, and specifically Mark Hanna, the Republican political operative and senator from Ohio, is going to back William McKinley. You might remember William McKinley from the McKinley Tariff. We talked about him a little while ago. He's sort of your standard Republican politician, Civil War veteran, all this stuff. He's going to run what's called front porch campaign, where he gives a series of interviews from his front porch in an attempt to paint himself as like a Washingtonian-style statesman and paint William Jennings Bryan as a dangerous radical for all this weird campaigning. And the trusts are going to throw huge amounts of money behind him to attempt to defeat William Jennings Bryan. Hopefully you can see that just one of these is an outlier as far as campaign spending goes. Yeah. And the basic goal of all of this is to demonstrate that William McKinley is a Washingtonian-style Republican statesman, and William Jennings Bryan is a dangerous demagogue and radical, just spouting out all this nonsense in order to try to rile up the population. As we see, there's also some elements of imperialism in this, with William Jennings Bryan being an anti-imperialist and William McKinley somewhat more in favor of expanding American power abroad, but we're going to spend more time on that next unit. The main argument that's important for this is the one shown in this political cartoon, which again, I hope is pretty straightforward. Targeting workers, arguing that the dangers of inflation outweigh any gains you might get from a progressive income tax or a shorter work week. Here's your end result. Pretty consistent. We start to see the Western states now becoming Democratic as opposed to Republican, but Republicans are still entrenched in the large population centers of the North and the old Midwest, which is more than enough to carry William McKinley to victory. And so William McKinley is going to take over, and we're going to get no profound change. We're going to get a high protective tariff. We're going to get a doubling down on the gold standard. And William McKinley's presidency means that we're going to get more involved in global affairs, which again, we're going to start next unit with, because it turns out there's been some trouble in the Philippines and in Cuba, two areas that the United States is really looking to potentially expand into, or at least is concerned about unrest there. And so all of this comes together to put William McKinley in the White House. And we're going to wrap it up with the failure of populism to build a vast sort of cross-employment coalition of sort of economically disadvantaged people. So that's the end of Unit 6. Thank you for listening.